On April 10, 2026, a capsule streaked through the atmosphere above the Pacific Ocean off the coast of San Diego at 33 times the speed of sound. Inside were 4 astronauts who had just traveled farther from Earth than any human being in history. When the Orion spacecraft hit the water and the recovery divers from the USS John P. Murtha reached the hatch, it marked the end of a 10-day journey to the moon and back, and the first time a crew had splashed down from deep space since the Apollo-Soyuz mission in 1975. That was Artemis II, and it was the easy part, because while those 4 astronauts were making history over 250,000 miles from home, NASA was quietly tearing up the entire plan for what comes next. The Lunar Gateway space station? Canceled. The upgraded SLS rocket? Canceled. The Artemis III moon landing everyone had been waiting for? Completely redefined. A brand new $20 billion moon base announced in its place. If you think you know the Artemis program, there is a very good chance that almost everything you have read is now out of date. This is the full breakdown. Every mission, every change, and why NASA's path back to the moon looks nothing like it did even 6 months ago. Kennedy Space Center, Florida, November 16, 2022, 1:47 in the morning. The Space Launch System lit its engines and climbed off Launch Complex 39B with 8.8 million pounds of thrust on its maiden flight. Over 300 feet of rocket carrying no crew, just the Orion capsule packed with sensors and mannequins. This was Artemis I, the uncrewed dress rehearsal for the entire program, and the first real test of a vehicle that had taken 11 years and over $20 billion to develop. The engines at the bottom were RS-25s, the same design that flew on every space shuttle mission, rebuilt and requalified for a single expendable use. After this flight, all 4 would be sitting at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. The SLS had survived congressional budget fights, presidential transitions, and constant criticism that commercial rockets could do the same job cheaper. None of that mattered on launch day. What mattered was whether it worked. For 25 days, Orion did exactly what it was supposed to do. It traveled 1.4 million miles, swung within 80 miles of the lunar surface, and reached nearly 270,000 miles from Earth, a new distance record for any crew-rated spacecraft. Along the way, it deployed 10 small CubeSat experiments. Only 4 of the 10 survived deep space long enough to phone home. The rest were declared lost. On December 11th, the capsule punched back into the atmosphere at over 24,000 miles per hour and splashed down in the Pacific. On paper, a clean success. Except engineers found more than 100 spots where chunks of the AVCoat heat shield material had cracked off and gone missing. The heat shield is the one thing standing between a crew and 5,000-degree plasma during re-entry. There is no backup, there is no abort option. If it fails, everyone dies. That is not dramatic framing, that is engineering reality. NASA spent 2 years investigating. They brought in Paul Hill, a former Space Shuttle return-to-flight lead flight director, to lead an independent review. The root cause turned out to be a porosity problem. During Orion's skip re-entry, where the capsule dips into the atmosphere, bounces up, then plunges in again, the outer char layer of the AVCoat hardened between those 2 dips and sealed shut. Hot gases generated by the still cooking material underneath had nowhere to escape. Pressure built up beneath the surface, cracked the outer layer from the inside, and blew pieces off into the airstream. Hill's independent team confirmed NASA's findings. The fix for future shields was straightforward, more microscopic venting pathways baked into the material so gas could escape without cracking the surface. A redesigned heat shield with higher permeability would be ready for Artemis III and beyond. The problem was that the Artemis II heat shield was already built, already bonded to the capsule structure, and there was no way to remove and replace it without delaying the mission by years. NASA's decision was to fly the existing shield, but change the re-entry angle, a steeper, direct plunge instead of the planned skip maneuver. Less time in the heat, less opportunity for the char layer to seal and trap gas. That bet would be tested 3 years later. After more than 2 years of delays, hydrogen leaks, helium problems, weather setbacks, and at least 5 separate schedule slips, the Space Launch System finally launched from Kennedy Space Center on April 1st, 2026, carrying 4 people toward the Moon. Commander Reed Wiseman, a NASA veteran who had previously served on the International Space Station. Pilot Victor Glover, who had flown on SpaceX Crew 1, and on this mission became the first person of color to travel to the Moon. Mission Specialist Christina Koch, holder of the longest single spaceflight by a woman at 328 days, who became the first woman to fly to the Moon. And Mission Specialist Jeremy Hansen from the Canadian Space Agency on his very first spaceflight, who became the first non-American to leave low Earth orbit. Ever. Their call sign was integrity. 4 people in a capsule about the size of a large SUV interior, strapped to a rocket taller than the Statue of Liberty, headed somewhere no human being had gone since 1972. The 10-day mission tested everything. Within hours of launch, the crew manually flew Orion around the discarded upper stage, rehearsing the docking maneuvers they would need for future lander missions. The next day, the European service module fired its engine and sent them on a free return trajectory around the far side of the Moon. That burn was so precise that 2 of 3 planned course corrections were canceled. On flight day 6, Orion reached over 250,000 miles from Earth, beating Apollo 13's record by about 4,000 miles, a new benchmark for how far any human has ever traveled from the planet they were born on. During the far side flyby, the crew spent 40 minutes in a total communications blackout behind the Moon, photographed portions of the far side never imaged from that angle, and witnessed a solar eclipse from deep space. Wiseman asked permission to name 2 craters after the spacecraft and his late wife. Then came the part that actually mattered: re-entry. Orion hit the atmosphere at Mach 33 on April 10th, following the modified direct entry trajectory. The capsule splashed down off San Diego, recovered by the USS John P. Murtha, and the heat shield? Char loss was, in NASA's words, significantly reduced compared to Artemis I. The modified trajectory had worked. But here is what got lost in the celebration. While that capsule was bobbing in the Pacific, the mission everyone thought would come next had already been canceled. 5 weeks before Artemis II even launched, on February 27, 2026, NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman stood in front of cameras and rewrote the entire Artemis program. Isaacman, the former Polaris Dawn commander confirmed as administrator in December 2025, announced 3 changes that rewrote the roadmap from top to bottom. First, Artemis III would not land on the Moon. The delays in both SpaceX's Starship human landing system and Blue Origin's Blue Moon Mark II lander meant neither vehicle would be ready in time. Instead, Artemis III would become an Earth orbit docking test. Think Apollo 9, not Apollo 11. In 1969, Apollo 9 was the mission where NASA tested the lunar module for the first time by flying it in Earth orbit, practicing docking procedures before the actual landing mission. Artemis III follows the same logic. A crew of 4 would rendezvous with one or both landers in orbit around Earth and test the new Axiom U moonwalking spacesuit. The landing was off the table. Second, the SLS Block 1B upgrade was dead. The exploration upper stage that was supposed to give the rocket more capacity, canceled. NASA would standardize on a near Block 1 configuration and eventually switch to a commercial upper stage, most likely ULA's Centaur 5. Mobile Launcher 2, built by Bechtel at over $1 billion and about 90% complete, was declared surplus. That is $1 billion of hardware with no mission. And this is the part that makes the story much bigger than rocket engineering. The SLS is not just a rocket, it is a congressional jobs program. Its supply chain touches factories and contractors in nearly every US state. Canceling the Block 1B was not just a technical decision, it was a political one, and it sent shockwaves through the aerospace industry. Third, and this got the most attention. On March 24th, at an event NASA branded as Ignition, the agency paused the Lunar Gateway, the small space station that was supposed to orbit the Moon as a staging point for landings. The one international partners had spent years building, shelved. The power and propulsion element, already delivered, would be repurposed for a Mars nuclear electric propulsion demonstrator called SR-1 Freedom. ESA's habitat module and refueling systems were suddenly without a destination. Years of work by engineers in Germany, France, Japan, and the UAE, all designed around a station that no longer exists in the current plan. ESA Director General Joseph Aschbacher attended the ignition announcement, but as of mid-2026, ESA has not publicly announced how it will reallocate those contributions. In its place, NASA announced something far more ambitious: a permanent base on the lunar surface, $20 billion over 7 years. And Isaac Mann framed it in terms that had nothing to do with science. "The clock is running in this great power competition," he said, "and success or failure will be measured in months, not years. That competition is China. The China Manned Space Agency has held firm to its goal of landing astronauts on the moon by 2030, a target announced in July 2023 and reaffirmed in October 2025, and their track record suggests they mean it. In 2024, Chang'e 6 successfully returned samples from the lunar far side, a first for any nation. The Tiangong space station is fully operational in low Earth orbit with a regular crew rotation. Their next-generation crew vehicle has flown a test mission. The Long March 10 heavy-lift rocket and the Mengzhou crew capsule are both in development. And China has a pattern of announcing ambitious timelines and then meeting them, which is more than most Western space agencies can say. So Artemis is not just a scientific program anymore, it is a race. And the finish line is the same patch of frozen ground at the lunar South Pole that both nations are aiming for. So what does the new Artemis roadmap actually look like? And how much of it should you believe? Artemis III, on paper targeted for late 2027, sends an SLS with 4 astronauts to low Earth orbit. Because NASA is saving its last upper stage for Artemis IV, the Artemis III rocket flies with a non-propulsive spacer instead. SpaceX launches a Starship HLS separately. Blue Origin may launch a Blue Moon variant as well. The crew practices rendezvous, docking, crew transfers, and tests the AX-EMU suit. If you are keeping score, this means the promise of landing the first woman and first person of color on the moon, originally tied to Artemis III, now shifts to Artemis IV. Koch and Glover already became the first woman and first person of color to travel to the moon on Artemis II. They just did not land on it. The crew for the actual landing has not been announced. NASA says names will come after Artemis III flies. And that brings us to the mission the entire program has been building toward. Artemis IV is, on paper, the big one. NASA currently targets early 2028 for the first crewed lunar landing since Gene Cernan climbed back into the Apollo 17 module in December 1972. More than 55 years ago. If schedules hold, the mission goes direct to the surface without gateway. A commercial lander launches first into lunar orbit. SLS sends Orion with 4 astronauts. They dock with the lander. 2 transfer over, descend to the South Pole, conduct at least 2 moonwalks wearing the AX-EMU suit, and return to Orion for the trip home. The AX-EMU is a completely new spacesuit design from Axiom Space, replacing the decades-old EMU suits used on the International Space Station. It is built for walking, bending, and working on rough terrain in 1/6 gravity, something the bulky Apollo A7L suits were never optimized for. During their moonwalks, the crew will collect rock and soil samples from areas near permanently shadowed craters, deploy seismometers and scientific instruments, and test equipment that every future mission depends on. Every minute of suit performance data feeds directly into planning for Artemis V and beyond. NASA has identified 9 candidate landing regions near the South Pole, all within a roughly 300-kilometer zone. Places like Malapert Massif, the rim of Nobel Crater, and Slater Plain. What makes this region valuable is permanently shadowed crater floors that may hold billions of years of trapped water ice, next to ridgelines that get near constant sunlight for solar panels. That combination is why you go to the South Pole instead of the equatorial plains Apollo visited. It is not about planting a flag, it is about building on the one spot that has the resources to sustain a permanent presence. Now pay attention to what comes next, because this is where NASA's plans go from ambitious to genuinely unprecedented. If you are subscribed to this channel, you already know I cover every major space development as it happens. If you are not, hit that subscribe button, because the rest of this video is where the story gets wild. Assuming Artemis IV goes to plan, Artemis V follows in late 2028 as the first mission of a formal moon base construction campaign. It flies Blue Origin's Blue Moon Mark II on its first crewed mission under a $3.4 billion contract, delivers the first lunar terrain vehicle, and the crew stays on the surface for over a month, the longest human presence on another world in history. That month on the surface is where everything changes. The crew drives the unpressurized rover across the South Polar terrain, built under a $4.6 billion contract with Intuitive Machines, Lunar Outpost, and Venturi Astrolab. They deploy permanent science stations designed to run autonomously between crew visits. They survey and prepare the sites where habitat modules and power systems will be placed on later missions. And they start learning, through trial and error, what it actually takes for humans to work productively on the moon for weeks at a time instead of hours. Apollo crews spent a maximum of 3 days on the surface. Artemis 5 targets more than 30. That is the pivot point. Artemis stops visiting the moon and starts building on it. NASA's Moonbase program executive Carlos Garcia Galen laid out a 3-phase plan at the ignition event. Phase 1. 2026 through 2028. Roughly $10 billion, 25 launches, and 21 robotic lander deliveries through the Commercial Lunar Payload Services program. The highlight is Moonfall, a fleet of 4 autonomous hopping drones from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Think Ingenuity on Mars, but bigger and designed for the moon. Each drone hops about 50 kilometers at a time, carrying 10 cameras, exploring the permanently shadowed craters that no rover can safely reach. Those craters have not seen sunlight in billions of years. Temperatures drop below -200 degrees Celsius. If recoverable water ice exists there, it changes the math on everything, because water means oxygen, drinking water, and rocket fuel manufactured on the moon instead of hauled from Earth. A single kilogram of payload currently costs roughly $1 million to land on the lunar surface. Finding usable water at the destination could eventually cut the cost of sustained operations by orders of magnitude. Phase 2, roughly 2029 through 2032, adds the JAXA and Toyota pressurized rover, nicknamed the Lunar Cruiser. This is not an open-air buggy like Apollo used. It is a 6-meter-long enclosed habitat on wheels with a 2-person crew and a 30-day range. Imagine driving a camper van across the moon for a month. 2 astronauts inside in shirt sleeves, not spacesuits, covering hundreds of kilometers of terrain that no human being has ever seen up close. They would park the rover near a crater rim, suit up for an EVA, collect samples, climb back in, pressurize, and drive to the next site. In exchange for contributing the lunar cruiser, Japan gets 2 astronaut slots on the lunar surface, targeted for no earlier than around 2031. By the end of this phase, NASA wants crews visiting the South Pole every 6 months. Phase 3, 2033 through 2036, is where the outpost becomes permanent. Italy's multi-purpose habitat, a 15-ton pressurized module on wheels built by Thales Alenia Space under a contract with the Italian Space Agency, becomes the first structure on the moon designed for people to actually live in, not a lander you sleep inside for 3 days. A habitat with life support, radiation shielding, and enough room to work and rest for extended stays. Canada contributes the Lunar Utility Vehicle from MDA Space, a robotic cargo hauler that moves equipment and supplies between landing zones and the base. And powering all of it is a surface fission reactor derived from the crusty prototype, producing about 100 kilowatts of electrical power. That is roughly enough to run 30 average American homes. On the moon, it keeps the habitat running, the rover charging, the science instruments collecting, and the oxygen extraction systems operating through the 2-week lunar night when solar panels are useless. The reactor sits on the rim of Shackleton Crater, and its target launch date is no earlier than 2030. On paper, the full scope comes to about $30 billion over 10 years, dozens of launches, and contributions from at least 4 countries. Isaac Mann's headline figure of $20 billion covers the core NASA investment. The rest comes from partners and commercial contracts. Now, should you believe any of this will happen on schedule? Honestly, probably not all of it. This is spaceflight. SpaceX's Starship HLS program has hit dozens of development milestones, and the first Starship V3 variant launched from Starbase Pad 2 in Boca Chica, Texas, in May 2026, which was a major step forward. The V3 is the configuration that the lunar lander is based on, so getting it off the ground was a prerequisite for everything that follows. The critical test that has not happened yet is in-space cryogenic propellant transfer, the ability to refuel Starship in orbit using tanker flights. The HLS lander needs to be refueled multiple times before it can fly to the moon. That orbital refueling demo has not flown, and until it does, the entire landing timeline carries a serious question mark. NASA's own assessment from late 2023 gave a 30% chance the lander would be 18 months or more behind schedule. Blue Origin is also moving. The Blue Moon Mark I cargo lander completed thermal vacuum testing at Johnson Space Center, and a full-scale Mark II crew cabin mock-up 16 meters tall arrived at Johnson in May 2026 for astronaut training. Their first uncrewed Pathfinder mission is planned to fly on the New Glenn rocket. Blue Origin's lander requires orbital refueling as well, using a Lockheed Martin cislunar transporter, adding another layer of complexity. On the spacesuit side, a NASA Inspector General report from April 2026 flagged concerns that the AXEMU suit might not be ready for a 2028 lunar landing. That alone could push the timeline. And then there is the budget, which is where Artemis stops being a space program and becomes a political story. The Trump administration's fiscal year 2027 request proposed cutting NASA by roughly 23%. The science budget alone faces a 47% reduction, with over 40 missions on the chopping block. Congress has responded with bipartisan opposition, just as they did in 2025 when they rejected similar cuts and passed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which allocated over $4 billion specifically for Artemis IV and V hardware. Here is the uncomfortable truth that space content rarely says out loud. Artemis survives not because of public enthusiasm for the moon. It survives because SLS hardware is built in Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, Utah, and Colorado, and no senator from those states will vote to kill the jobs. Boeing builds the core stage at Michoud Assembly Facility in New Orleans. Northrop Grumman builds the solid rocket boosters in Utah. Aerojet Rocketdyne builds the engines in Mississippi. Those contracts run through districts represented by members of the appropriations committees that fund NASA. The moon base survives because China is going. The commercial contracts survive because SpaceX and Blue Origin have lobbyists and launch sites in states that matter electorally. Artemis is science, yes. It is also industrial policy, a jobs program, and a geopolitical chess move. That is not cynical. It is just how $100 billion programs stay alive across multiple administrations. The program is funded for now. If Artemis IV slips to 2029, the United States and China could be racing to the same region of the lunar South Pole in the same year. That fact alone may be the strongest guarantee that Congress keeps writing checks. As of May 2026, the Artemis program has flown 2 missions. 4 astronauts have traveled to the moon and returned safely. The rocket works. The heat shield works. 2 companies are building competing landers. A 3rd country has put an astronaut beyond low Earth orbit for the first time. 5 nations have signed contracts to contribute hardware to a permanent base at the lunar South Pole. And the administrator of NASA is openly framing the program as a race against a competitor that does not miss deadlines. The plan has changed drastically. It will change again. Schedules will slip. Budgets will be fighted over. Hardware will break and be redesigned. But consider where things stood 4 years ago. In 2022, Artemis was an unproven rocket with an untested capsule and a timeline that most space reporters treated as fiction. Now there are astronauts who have flown around the moon, a heat shield fix that holds, 2 landers in advanced development, and a construction plan with signed international contracts from Japan, Italy, Canada, and the European Space Agency. The gap between what Artemis is today and what it was in 2022 is larger than the gap between what it is today and what NASA says it will be in 2030. That does not guarantee success. It does mean the program has earned the right to be taken seriously. For the first time since Apollo, going back to the moon is not a PowerPoint presentation. It is a flight manifest. This story is not finished, not even close. If this video helped you understand where the Artemis program actually stands, drop a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. I cover every update to the moon missions as they happen, so you will not miss the next chapter.